So in this part, we analyze the agricultural risk assessment. So we talked before in the part one of risk management in general, but in this part we focused our attention on agricultural risk assessment. So we would point out that the assessment of risk in the primary sector will be built around an integrated approach. So the framework views on the assessment for the primary sector will be identified as a tool to help decision maker to understand risk exposure in a way to provide the basis for developing appropriate risk management solution. In this context, uh, the risk assessment, anyway, is a sort of consultative, time-bound process that provide an orderly way to analyze, identify, and then prioritize risks. So the process facility risk management policy and program designed by providing a framework and tools for decision making. So we could consider the agricultural sector risk assessment target audience include country level stakeholders involved in selected agricultural commodity system, development agency, decision maker, and developing country policymakers, because this step will be very important for developing country, because in developed when we already have this kind of assessment that has been carried out in the decades in the past. So this process should be rigorous, inclusive, in a way to identify potential solution to mitigate, transfer, and cope with agricultural risk. It is also an entry point for mainstreaming assessment for the risk management solution in national development strategy, policy, and programs. So by bringing together a broad group of stakeholders from the public, private, non-governmental sector, an assessment of risk in the primary sector can facilitate, of course, knowledge and the exchange between academic discipline, ministry, stakeholders. So the benefit of a more holistic, and targeted risk management strategy are of course many. Adopting a risk management strategy can help mitigate risk before they occur. So an ex-ante strategy would be facilitate the management in a way. I don't know, we say before that public intervention could be related also to incentivize the net and so on, no? So if we have a clear perception, feeling about the peril or the risk exposure of crops and region in, for the extreme events or pest in the sea, we could ex ante prepare the farmers' resilience. So, agriculture risk assessment is simply an orderly process to analyze, identify, prioritize risk, which serve as the basis for design or risk management strategy in overall. So the follow-up of incorporation of the assessment findings into government policies and plans is not addressed in this presentation for single country, but we just carry on a general overview of this process, because every country could lead this phase of the assessing risk depending on political economy, institutional strength, procedure, fiscal constraints, so on. So the agricultural assessment in terms of risk identify the key vulnerability in the area requiring priority attention in terms of investment, capacity building, policy reform. At the end, the main objective is to help decision makers understand the risk exposure of the primary sector. And this understanding, of course, related for the all stakeholder, so politics, farmers, and so on, in a way to identify risk management strategy for prioritized risk identified. So what about the implementation of the risk assessment? Firstly, the risk assessment may be tailored to take into account the sector structure and the institutional dynamics, in a way to include factors such as supply chain characteristics, institution, fiscal constraint, stakeholders' capacity to deal with the effects of realized risk. Likewise, risk management solution identified in a particular country will not, as we said before, necessarily fit the context of another country. However, we have some similarity among countries that may appear when we carry on the risk assessment for several countries. Of course, the risk assessment is a dynamic process that requires careful planning given the participation of a variety of stakeholders and the degree of analytical skills and experience decided for the assessment team. So this sequential flow process that we have in this slide has proven to be very practical in carry on the agricultural risk assessment to date, but it should be adapted to the particular circumstances of the country where it's applied, as we said. It should respond to the assessment specific objective. So the step-by-step activities shown in this diagram are very sequentially. The finding on each step inform and serve as the basis for the next one. So the immediate outcome of the process is a short list of priority in terms of risk that has been identified. Based on the risk prioritization, a short list of potential risk management solutions can be identified. So this outcome is the basis for build a framework risk management strategy that in turn has various steps ending in an action plan for implementation. So the short-listed solution can be evaluated using decision filters, of course, such as flexibility, feasibility, affordability, either in a consultative stakeholder setting or individually. So when governments assume a holistic approach and improve their ability to assess risk and their interlinkage, they can more effectively help farmers manage their risk by providing targeted information and training where they are most needed. So translating the integrated risk management strategy into concrete action requires the use of several kinds of implementation instruments. If we could summarize these several steps, we could focus on the historical bias, so the assessment carried out to date have been structured to analyze risk from an historical perspective. This type of assessment provides limited opportunity for analyze new risk that might occur in the future. So these steps is very important, very relevant if we consider what we said in the part one, no? When we talk about the transition from risk era to uncertainty one, no? Due to the climate change trends that give the observation of the past very complicated to build tools and policy to manage the future weather risk, no? So this is a very, very important step to carry on. Of course, we have the question related to the data limitation, because the accessibility and reliability of good quality disaggregated time series data on the key variables are often very limited, which this eventuality would negatively affect the ability to conduct a true risk assessment. But we have the subjective bias. So despite all efforts to bring objectivity and give clear analytic indicators, a very broad analysis and risk assessment is essentially a subjective tool. And this is one of the more big challenging aspects, especially during risk prioritization. And so this step is very, very important to manage careful, because especially in developing country is very important to prioritize risk in a good manner. There is a question related to the risk appetite, because poor producers have fewer buffers and therefore tend to have a low risk appetite. Many of these households manage risk by avoiding productivity enhancing inputs, preferring yield stability over higher yield inputs that may increase volatility. So this is a very important aspect that we need to consider when we carry on a risk assessment. There is a question related to the attribution. This is a rare that one event leads to losses such that all losses can be attributed to it. In many cases, when we face multiple risk events occurring in a given year, which make it difficult to attribute proportion to different risk. No, this is another important aspect. So to identify the several risks that occur in the overall loss in the harvest time. And lastly, we have the question related to client expectation, because the risk assessment is an intermediate process for managing risk, not a final product. So government policy will and commitment are necessary to translate the suggested solution into a concrete government strategy and, of course, budgeting. So the risk assessment analysis can be complement other type of risk assessment. For example, households or area-based risk assessment typically focused on the vulnerability of different type of household. This is women in disadvantaged position, for example. The application of informal risk sharing and coping mechanism, and the need and scope for supplementary social protection measure, or the hazard vulnerability assessment intended to justify the role and design of agriculture insurance for, I don't know, specific segmental levels of stakeholders exposed to production risk. Or the financial risk assessment that focus on the possible budgetary and other macroeconomic impact of major shocks. So the vast majority of farmers in developing countries are smallholders who are particularly vulnerable to external shocks that could disrupt their livelihoods and encircle them into recurrent poverty traps. So the mitigation of agricultural risk is increasingly focused on reducing the exposure and increasing the resilience of production system and livelihoods to adverse impacts. So the risk assessment therefore largely seeks to understand which characteristics make a country, primary sector or segment of farmers resilient, and to identify the specific measures and processes that strengthen resilience. Because resilience can be strengthened in many different ways, at different levels through political economy, sociology, and so on. For example, drought can be countered by building irrigation system, improving weather harvesting technique, and so on. But we have, for example, also the need to build a safety net, public safety net, when very severe drought occur, no? For example, how many financial resources public needs to cope for a very severe drought in a certain country. So this is one of the open question that we need to consider when carry on the risk assessment for a certain region. So one key strategy for mainstreaming resilience into farming system is the concept and practice of climate smart agriculture. Climate smart agriculture is an approach for transforming and reorienting agriculture system to support food security under the new reality of climate change, because we introduced in the part one how the impact of a climate change trend is very important in terms of food security on global scale, because we have on one side hundreds of millions of people that, considering the economic growth of China, India, and so on. So 100 of million of people ask for food, beef, and so on. But on the other side, we have also 8 billion of people on the planet. So climate change is a very, very big challenges in a way to ensure food security on a global scale. And climate smart agriculture is a very important task on the table in a way to set these challenges. So the risk assessment, agricultural risk assessment, promises to serve as a methodological guidance, to identify, justify strategy that strengthen the resilience of agricultural system, aiming to adapting agriculture to climate change condition, as we say in this figure. The processes can be made by reconciling the short-term objective of risk management with the medium to longer-term objective of climate change adaptation. Early incorporation of climate smart agriculture into farming system practices also could contribute to the objective of increasing productivity, managing volatility, and more generally boosting overall farming system resilience. So an analysis or risk assessment can serve as a key entry point for operationally in a way to carry on a climate smart agriculture strategy by providing the analytical and operational tool to strengthen resilience in agricultural system. So recalling what introduced before, a practical way to identify solution is by classifying possible risk management strategy into three main categories: mitigation, risk transfer, that are in the ex-ante strategy, and coping, that is related to the ex-post strategy. So the appropriate set of strategy depends in part on participant capacity to effectively use them. So if we look at risk mitigation strategy, they are actions taken prior to a risk event to reduce the likelihood of risk or the severity of losses, as we introduced in part one. They are particularly useful for risks that occur with relatively high frequencies, but with lower impact intensity. Recall also the risk box that introduced in part 1. So risk mitigation options are numerous, varied. No, example include adoption of improved agronomic practices, such as soil drainage, for example, conservation farming, and the use of short duration disease and stress resistant cultivar, irrigation, flood control, infrastructure, soil and water conservation measure, and so on. No? We point out before, emphasize the role, historical role of the crop income diversification, no? As a way to mitigate risk as one of the most important ex-ante strategy for farmers. The risk transfer is the strategy that is most important in terms, is the most important one in terms of a public intervention, because we know that as not all effect on realized risk can be mitigated. So risk transfer tools and mechanism transfer to the potential financial consequences of particular risk from one party to a willing third party, usually for a fair premium, is one of the most important public policy in agriculture. Because this mechanism usually trigger compensation in the case of a risk-generated loss, and as the most important way, the most usual way that in developed country government put in place in a way to support farmers' revenue volatility. And in this context, the most way could be identified the crop insurance premium support by government intervention. Risk coping, we anticipated in part 1, but it's important to emphasize this aspect. We know that some risk cannot be mitigated or transferred, so risk coping strategies are needed to help stakeholders better absorb and recover from their impact. So this instrument improve the affected population resilience to withstand and cope with the events through ex-ante preparation to sustain production livelihoods following an event. Examples include some form of compensation, social safety net programs. Just recall the slide before, that when a severe drought occurs, it's very important to have a safety net in terms of public solidarity fund that could sustain, especially in developing country, the livelihood of the population. Of course, such interventions are often financial beneficial, and the ability to quickly respond to events often reduces the losses, economic losses. So this figure is important because it illustrates this risk management strategy in the context of increasing layers of risk, depending on the probability of occurrence, so in terms of frequency, and the intensity or potential to cause losses, so severity. No? So we need to consider together the question relies on the frequencies and the severity of the damages. So the combination of different activities selected to manage risk ultimately depends largely on the findings of the agriculture sector risk assessment. The characteristics of identify the risk, various several actors existing, capacity to manage risk, the fiscal constraint to implement an integrated strategy. So this framework can be applied to prioritize risk and intervention in a country with many risk management practices already in place, whereby stakeholders identify priority and gaps in their current risk management strategies to enable them to adapt to a changing risk landscape. So these instruments fall into three main categories. So when we talk about the adaptation and risk assessment tasks, the first one is the policy reform. So improved risk management often entails policy reform, for example, legal or regulatory reform to improve access to agricultural inputs, changes in information policy to make agricultural information easily accessible to all, and so on. The second one is related to agricultural investments. Although policy reform mainly require political will, other risk mitigation measures can be costly. Example are financial investment in irrigation infrastructure, soil and water conservation, weather infrastructure, and so on. Because some of these measures may already be part of a government program, and with the risk assessment we could simply calling for additional investment to strengthen capacity in those areas more vulnerable to external shock. Of course, last but not least, the technical assistance that is geared toward building local stakeholders' capacity. For example, training in price risk management, feasibility study for various tools, float risk modeling work, development of early warning system. We know that recent development in information system addressing agricultural risk can be easily transferred to public and private institutions that can adapt the tool to a country-specific condition. Risk management type of risk. So, time series data analysis. This technique is preferred for assessing production risk. It involves, we know, statistical analysis of annual performance indicator for major agricultural commodity, changes in area, yield, production. Most Ministry of Agriculture keep historical record of these indicators. So ideally, it is optimal to obtain data disaggregated by region to isolate and analyze region with major volatility and production losses. In the absence of time series data, production analysis can rely on yearly reports written, by government, for example, agency, commodity producer association, and so on. But it would be very important to have annual data for this question that has been recorded by public entity. The secondary data analysis is based on an early literature review or peer-reviewed publication by academic institution, social scientists, agricultural specialists, and I don't know, media reports help could help build a storyline related to occurrence of risk exposure, and vulnerability of various community. No, recent analytical report that analyzes the performance of agricultural supply chain usually contain valuable information regarding efficiency and productivity constraints and so on. Of course, the stakeholders' involvement in the process would be very important because stakeholders' interview could be very important technique to assess the stakeholders' capacity to manage risk. So how they respond to shock and in a way to analyze their degree of vulnerability in the presence of several risks. So interviews can identify the causality of risk and risk transmission along supply chain as different actors perceive and react differently to risk. Moreover, interview with key informants who have extensive experience in analyzing the agricultural sector are a valuable way to build a very realistic risk storyline. The qualitative analysis concerning on the question that not all risk can be assessed using quantitative techniques that pose their reliability or the use of qualitative analysis that need to be introduced. This is particularly true when comparing the importance and ranking of non-measurable risks, such as enabling environmental risk. So team member participation in the agricultural risk assessment use their best judgment during the prioritization process. Of course, workshop, group discussion with the stakeholders at different levels, stage in the risk assessment process are particularly helpful for securing feedback and validating findings that would emerge along the process. So in this case, the sequential flow process is a dynamic one that requires careful planning given the participation of a variety of stakeholders and the degree of analytical skill and experience decided for the assessment team. No? And this figure summarizes the step-by-step the risk assessment process that we carried out till now. So this sequential flow process has proven to be very practical in carry on the risk assessment to date, but it should be adapted to the particular circumstances of the country where it's applied and should respond to the assessment specific objective. The step-by-step activities shown in this diagram are sequential, and the finding of each step inform and serve as the basis for the next, as we see before respect to the climate change, construction. The risk assessment outcome is a short list, also in this case, of prioritized risk and corresponding solution. So this outcome is the basis for designing a risk management strategy that in turn has various steps ending in an action plan for implementation. The action plan details the intervention that stakeholder needs to implement to complement current intervention and make the agricultural sector more resilient to shock. So if we could summarize the risk assessment process for agricultural sector, we could say that it's important to understand the context by analyzing current and past agricultural policy strategies, understand the dynamics of the political economy when possible. This is not simply, especially for developing country, because we have a lack of information. So identify the structure of the primary sector and the role it plays within the broader economy. And this is a very important step for developing country, because we know that agricultural sector is a large share of the GDP of the economy. That we need to analyze the trend in time series data. Hopefully that we have the certified reliable data in a way to analyze the risk exposure of several regions, yield, the production, and so on. Then quantify and analyze variation in yield by commodity region. Identify major risk by crop region stakeholders group. Analyze the level of vulnerability among various stakeholders group. Analyze trend and variation, time series data of price various agricultural commodities and inputs. So one important task is also understanding the agricultural sector. This is a very important task because, for example, in terms of demand condition, it's very important the identification of major markets of the commodity in question, export, regional, domestic, and the use of the commodity, characteristic of the commodity, quality attributes, demand and supply dynamics, and current and emerging market trends. Also very important to analyze and understand the supply chain, no? Because the current structure of supply chain, which include the flow of goods, information, finance, and degree of concentration of different operators. Have an overview on the stakeholder and their function, no? So a brief description of the various actors involved in the agricultural system. What are the future outlook? Near-term projection in terms of demand projection, supply forecast, and so on. Governance and coordination mechanism, dominant governance structure and coordination mechanism, and how they promote or inhibit the flow of information, risk sharing, risk management across the sector, and the broader global enabling environment, as well as national regional enabling environment, for example, national regional trade policy, level trade cooperation integration. This play a key role in shaping the sector, so this is useful to identify the implication for risk in the sector. This is an example for Mozambique that could be useful to understand, especially in developing country, how it's important to carry on the risk assessment analysis for the primary sector. So, provided enough depth has been devoted to the team should have information to construct a long list of risks that may be mentioned as source of volatility, in a way to serve as the basis for the process of risk identification. We know that in some cases enabling environment risks are prevalent because of the nature of the political economy in the sector. In other cases, weather risk might be significant, especially for agricultural supply chain, producing food crops and livestock. market risk be more predominant. So we could represent that for Mozambique agricultural sector, the key identified risk as illustrated in the table, and we know that we could see that the initial risk or risk that arises from the preliminary literature review and data analysis will be subject to further analysis based on their historic frequency of occurrence and their capacity to cause major loss. And the table illustrates the long list of risk that has been identified in the risk assessment phases for this country. And the most important question that drove up looking at the table is that the agricultural sector in Mozambique is highly vulnerable to rainfall variability. So a detailed quantitative analysis of the impact of rainfall at disaggregated level would be very useful in a way to build public intervention, implementation of tool, and ex-ante risk management, support farmers in some way. So in a way to have a very, very more resilient primary sector looking at the most important risks that are related on the availability of rain. So several methods can be used to quantify risk, ranging from calculation the simple variation from a mean value to using sophisticated statistical software application, as is commonly done in the insurance industry. So the focus area is on conducting a simple time series analysis of risk events in a way to arrive at the monetary value of losses caused by production risk. For production risk, calculations are made individually for each commodity under study. They are then aggregated to quantify losses for the whole agricultural sector. So the step-by-step methodology to quantify production losses using yield data and production data is depicted in the table that we present in this slide in the following. Alternatively, if time series data of yield cannot be obtained, or I don't know, and are not reliable because public institution does not collect in the past this kind of data, the calculation can be made using production data from other sources, or at least from Faustat, no? Using production data instead of yield data means that the loss calculation also include changes in area, not just yield, because production equals yield times area. So it is important to use the same methodology for all commodity so that the quantification of losses use the same yardstick, no, to enable risk prioritization. And this is one important task, especially in developing country where the source of statistical information often is very, very difficult to collect. No? So apart from the frequency of the events and the severity of the impact, a third variable will ultimately determine the ranking of risk. The stakeholders' capacity to manage the identified risk. See the figure that we recall from World Bank study. For example, if the team finds that stakeholders already have high capacity to manage particular identified risk, this particular risk will not be ranked among the most important. So as mentioned earlier, the capacity to manage each identified risk is assessed mainly during stakeholders interview, no? When we carry on this aspect, but also by using secondary information collected during the background work prior to the field visit. So the table that we are looking at show the prioritization matrix completed for Malawi. This is an example that has been carried out for Malawi from World Bank study, and looking at all crops of this country. So the dark area, upper right hand corner, represents the most significant risk because of their potential to cause the greatest losses and the high frequency of their occurrence. The lighter dark box represents the second level of importance, whereas the clear box represents identified risk that either have low potential to cause damages or their frequency of occurrence is low, or both. Note that existing losses can be a useful proxy for capacity to manage risk. On the one hand, if existing losses are low, so that low impact, despite the frequent occurrence of risk, then the capacity to manage risk is supposedly high and vulnerability low. On the other hand, if existing losses are substantial, so high impact, even for low frequency events, then vulnerability is assumed to be high. The final outcome of the aggregated risk prioritization process is a list of key priority risks that explain the causes of agriculture GDP volatility and need to be addressed to reduce losses in the agriculture sector. So the highest priority risk are those located in the boxes in the upper right corner of the aggregated risk prioritization matrix. So the next step will be to identify solution for those prioritized risk. This is clear the overall process. So identify and prioritize risk in a way to build a framework that could foster, identify solution for this prioritized risk. So following what we illustrate in the table before for Malawi, we have the column of risk, the column of mitigation, respect of the several risks that are drought, price volatility, disease, pest, regulatory risk. And we have a column mitigation for each risk, and we have the transfer, the hedging, and the coping in the last column. So if the line of inquiry was followed during the field visit, the team has identified in Malawi a list of potential solutions that are meant to contribute to the management of identified risk. So once the sector risk prioritization matrix is complete, as in the table above, the team analyzed the long list of potential solutions for the prioritized risk in the matrix and divide those potential solutions into the three categories of risk strategy. So the initial long list is often not exhaustive and might not provide concrete next step, but it does provide a menu of options from which to choose. And this table is a summary because it shows the long list prepared for Malawi after risk assessment analysis. So another aspect is in the assessment phases is the understanding of vulnerability to risk. So as vulnerability is used to prioritize risk and in a way to design the target risk management intervention, assessing vulnerability is an important task of the risk assessment process, because the concept of vulnerability can be applied at different levels, so that farmers, household, community, and other various areas, this is farm, district, province, region, which of course can lead to confusion, no? For the purpose of our object, vulnerability is defined as the capacity of stakeholders to manage agricultural risk and recover from external shock. So we focus on this concept of vulnerability. So the capacity to manage risk is assessed during the background work prior to the field visit and during the field visit through stakeholder interview. So vulnerability variation between households can be seen as the function of the three factors: sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure, where for sensitivity we means the degree of impact of the initial shock. So sensitivity can be thought as the elasticity of the household's welfare, that is consumption level, in response to a shock. The adaptive capacity is the ability of the households to assess ex-post coping strategy that help it return to pre-shock welfare levels. So in this case, we are considering the presence of a public safety net, no? The ex-post financial intervention. It's public solidarity good warranted to the farmers. The exposure is the probability of a given shock materializing and affecting the household's assets. Whenever possible, the analysis of these three aspects should be done at the local level using available welfare indicators. So with the exception for poor smallholder farmers, most stakeholders along the commodity supply chain can discuss their vulnerability to risk during interview. For poorest, who are often the most vulnerable, most exposed, focus group discussion are an important technique to discuss their risk, mitigation strategy, and coping mechanism after a disaster. But we need to consider that for poorest one, for developing country, is very, very important the presence of a sort of international assistance. Because we know that in case of storm, flooding, extreme drought, we know that international solidarity is a very, very key element in a way to give some relief to population of this country, because we know that when we face systemic events, the only way is to guarantee a sort of public safety net, no? So this is one of the most challenging tasks that we have to afford in a way to guarantee the food security in a global scale. So, in some cases, certain risks may have relatively low impacts on the sector or geographic region, but relatively high impacts on a particularly vulnerable groups of the population. So targeting this group with risk management mechanism may be a priority. For example, losses in a region A may outweigh those of region B in terms of monetary value. But if the majority of the country's food insecure live in region B, and this is dependent on crops prone to risk related to production losses, policymakers may want to prioritize risk management intervention in region B. No? Particularly targeting the food insecure. So similarly, finding out that the particularly vulnerable part of the supply chain is predominantly run by women may, because of the country-specific cultural context, influence the design of the relevant risk management policy. No? The box that we will see discusses the risk assessment for Brazil, which the vulnerability assessment influenced the risk management policy priority.